In a lake-effect blizzard on Michigan's Keweenaw, a Navy SEAL hung by his wrists from a beam inside an abandoned timber mill, blood freezing into the snow below. Off-duty and haunted, Special Agent Claire Rowan tried to walk her mind quiet until her German Shepherd Argo caught the scent and pulled her off the trail. She found him barely breathing, and the storm kept swallowing the tracks of smugglers planning to move people across the ice before dawn. If you believe God still sees the unseen and sends help in the darkest storms, type Amen. Where are you watching from today, and will you like and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances? The Keweenaw Peninsula wore winter the way an old soldier wore scars, quietly, completely, without apology. Lake-effect snow poured from a sky the color of pewter, thick enough to swallow the world in soft white layers that hid roads, erased footprints, and made distance feel like a rumor. The wind came off Lake Superior with a hard, clean bite. It slid between the pines, rattled branches, and pressed against the cabin walls as if testing every nail, every seam, every human promise that warmth could hold. Special Agent Claire Rowan had come here to recover, not to chase anything. She was 30, lean and athletic in the practical way of someone who had learned to run on too little sleep and too much adrenaline. Her hair was dark brown, pulled into a low ponytail that kept it from her eyes, and her face had the sharp lines of focus, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, eyes that seemed to watch even when she tried to rest. There was a pale mark near her left eyebrow, the kind you got from one bad second in a doorway years ago. It wasn't a vanity scar. It was a reminder that life could change on the wrong hinge. She was officially on leave, but not truly off the grid. The Bureau Hadwan call status was a compromise, a quiet place to breathe after a long mission, with the understanding that if something catastrophic happened nearby, she could be tapped. Claire told herself that was fine. In truth, her nervous system hadn't gotten the memo that the mission was over. She woke up before dawn every day, heart hammering as if an alarm had been shouted into her blood. Sometimes it was a dream. Sometimes it was nothing at all, just the sound of wind shifting against wood, a subtle creak in the roof, the furnace kicking on. Her mind would translate it into footsteps, into radio static, into the sudden silence that always came right before something went wrong. She tried to eat. She tried to read. She tried to watch the snow through the window and convince herself that a person could simply sit still and be safe. But safety had become a concept her body no longer trusted. She had succeeded on her last assignment, the kind of success that got people commended and photographed and called brave, yet it left her hollowed out. There were faces she couldn't forget, voices that had begged, the thin look in a victim's eyes when they realized help had come, and still might not be enough. Claire did not speak about it in detail. She did not have to. The strain lived in the set of her shoulders and the way her hands clenched and unclenched for no reason. That was why Argo mattered. Argo was a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a sable coat that looked like smoke and earth mixed together, dark along the back, lighter at the legs and face, with intelligent amber-brown eyes that missed very little. He carried himself with the confidence of a trained K-9, but his temperament held a steadier kind of warmth, too. When Claire's breath got shallow, Argo would press close, not demanding attention, simply anchoring her to the present, with his body heat and calm weight. His ears were always listening. His nose was always working. And when he looked at her, it was as if he was saying, without language, that he would not let her drift too far into the dark. Midday brought no sun, only brighter gray. The snow kept falling. Claire clipped Argo's leash and took him outside because routine was a rope you held when everything inside you wanted to unravel. Her boots crunched on packed snow near the cabin, then sank deeper as she moved toward the tree line. She stayed on what passed for a safe path, an old service road half buried, marked by thin, reflective stakes that disappeared and reappeared as the storm shifted. She breathed in cold air until it stung. She tried to let the white silence do its work. They walked for 15 minutes in near quiet, only the hiss of snow and the soft jingle of Argo's tag. Claire's thoughts were beginning to loosen, just slightly, like a muscle unclenching, when Argo stopped so fast the leash went taut. His body stiffened. His ears snapped forward. He lowered his head and drew a deep breath, slow and deliberate, as if tasting the air. Claire followed his gaze. Nothing moved but snow. "Argo," she said softly, not as a command, but as a question. He did not look at her. He took another breath, then stepped off the path without hesitation, pulling her toward a stand of pines where the snow lay deeper and unbroken. Claire's first instinct was refusal. The trail was there for a reason. The woods in a blizzard were how people disappeared. She tightened her grip on the leash. "No," she murmured, and felt the word wobble in her throat. But Argo's posture wasn't curious. It was purposeful. He moved like he had found a line only he could see. Her phone was already cold in her glove when she pulled it out. She dialed 911 and gave the location as best she could. "I'm describing the path markers and the general direction." The dispatcher's voice was calm but blunt. Roads were bad, response would be delayed, and she should not go deeper. Claire listened, nodded, though no one could see, and said she understood. When the call ended, she stood still for a moment, the wind pressing against her face like a hand. A sharp metallic clink echoed from somewhere ahead, one clean sound, then silence, like a chain tapping wood, like a tool dropped and swallowed by snow, and Claire's body froze as if the noise had snapped a wire inside her. Argo pulled again, harder. Claire's heart was pounding now, not from exertion, but from recognition. She had heard that kind of sound in places she did not want to remember. She looked back toward the path, toward the safety stakes, toward the lie of ordinary life. Then she looked down at Argo's shoulders, steady, determined, and made her choice. Not as an agent chasing a case, as a human being who could not ignore what her partner had found. They pushed through drifts, snow up to Claire's shins, then her knees in places. The trees thickened. The wind became more muted, but the cold deepened, as if the forest held its own private winter. After a few minutes, the shape of a building emerged through the blowing white. Dark timber, sagging roof, a wide-open mouth of a doorway. Hawthorne Timber Mill. The old sawmill had been abandoned for years, a skeleton of wood and rust that locals avoided. In summer, it was eerie. In winter, it looked like a grave with walls. Argo led her inside. The air under the roof was slightly calmer, but it smelled wrong. Old oil, wet wood, and something sharper beneath it. Argo's nose went low, and he moved with the precision of training, tracking a line that curved past a broken conveyor and toward a beam that cut across the ceiling like the rib of a giant. Claire saw him before she understood him. A man hung beneath the beam, wrists bound above his head to a length of chain looped over the timber. His boots barely touched the floor. His head lolled to one side. His face was swollen and bruised, stubble rough along a strong jaw, his hair cut short in a way that spoke of discipline rather than fashion. Even in the dim light, Claire could tell his build, broad shoulders, hard muscle under torn layers, was the kind earned, not gifted. He was alive, barely. His breath came in thin, ragged pulls, each one a fight. Claire moved fast. She kept her voice low, the way you did near sleeping danger. "Hey," she said, stepping close enough to see the skin rubbed raw at his wrists. "Stay with me. Don't try to talk yet." She pulled out a compact rescue knife from her coat pocket, then a small cutter meant for restraints. The chain was cold enough to burn. Her fingers worked anyway, steady through sheer will. Argo stood at the doorway, body angled outward, ears tuned to the storm. A low growl vibrated in his chest when the distant sound of an engine drifted faintly through the snow. Far away, muffled, but real. Claire's stomach tightened. The restraint gave. The man dropped into her arms with a weight that felt both heavy and frighteningly limp. She lowered him to the floor, checked his airway, pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse, weak, but there. Hypothermia was biting at him. Shock, too. She pulled off her outer layer and wrapped it around his torso, and then pressed her gloved hand against his cheek to keep him oriented. His eyes fluttered open. They were pale, exhausted, but clear enough to carry the truth. "Name?" Claire said gently. He swallowed with effort. "Luke Mercer." The words scraped out like they hurt. "What happened?" Claire asked, already knowing the answer would be ugly. Luke's gaze drifted toward the doorway, toward the white glare of the storm. "I tracked vehicles," he whispered. "Illegal transport. Got seen." He coughed, winced. "Told them. I was a drunk worker. Lost." A bitter half-smile flickered and died. "They didn't buy it?" Claire's jaw tightened. She could feel her training trying to turn this into a case file, but her heart heard it as something simpler. Someone had been left here to die. Argo gave a sharp warning huff from the entrance. Not barking, not panicking, just a signal. Luke's eyes sharpened a fraction. He gathered what little strength he had and forced the sentence out, urgent now. "Tonight," he rasped, "they move people across the frozen lake." Claire's blood went cold in a new way, because she believed him, because the storm was perfect cover, because she could already imagine the dark shapes in the snow, the silence of fear, the way cold made every mistake final. Argo tugged her sleeve, then trotted to the threshold and pointed his nose toward the ground outside. Claire followed, supporting Luke enough to glance down. Under the fresh powder, a faint track cut the snow, narrow, fast, deliberate. Snowmobile tread, barely covered, as if it had passed minutes ago. Claire looked at the track, then back at Luke's bruised face, and understood that the storm wasn't the only thing moving in these woods tonight. The mill sat behind them like a bad memory made of timber and rust, but the cold still clung to Claire's clothes as if it had teeth. Deputy Tessa Pike arrived in a winter-capable SUV that looked like it had been built for this peninsula's grudges. Thick tires, a battered front bumper, and a light bar dusted with ice. Tessa was 26, average height with a wiry strength that came from shoveling snow more days than not. Her hair was blonde but dulled by winter light, pulled into a tight braid that stayed out of her face. She had pale skin that flushed quickly in the cold and a small freckle cluster on one cheek that made her look younger than her eyes did. Those eyes were steady and watchful, the eyes of someone who had learned early that in a storm, hesitation could be its own kind of danger. She didn't waste words. She took one look at Luke's bound wrists, his sagging posture, and the way Claire's hands were already moving like a medic's, and she nodded once as if filing it into a drawer in her mind labeled, "Handle it." "EMS is at the community center," she said, voice clipped but not unkind. "We can't get an ambulance up here fast. We'll get him warm first." Claire helped Luke into the back seat with careful pressure, keeping him upright. Luke's face had turned a bruised gray under his beard shadow, and when he shivered, it looked like his bones were trying to break free of their own skin. Up close, he was all hard edges softened by damage, broad shoulders under torn layers, a short military cut gone slightly uneven, and a jawline that still held stubbornness even as his body threatened to give up. And he was the kind of man who had spent years forcing pain into the background and paying for it later. Argo jumped in after them, sable coat dusted with snow, ears high, nose working, eyes tracking every movement as if the SUV itself might lie. The drive to town was short on the map and long in real life. Snow blew sideways across the road in waves, hiding the edges, erasing the world beyond the headlights. Tessa drove like someone who had learned respect for ice the hard way, no sudden turns, no ego, just steady corrections and a quiet, stubborn patience. Claire sat beside Luke in the back, pressing the heel of her hand against the blanket around his chest, counting his breaths. Each inhale was thin. Each exhale fogged the air with a faint, trembling cloud. In the front seat, Tessa spoke into her radio low and fast, giving coordinates and a blunt summary. Adult male, hypothermia risk, restraints, assault. Then, without a pause, potential trafficking, need sheriff. The words landed like stones. Claire watched Argo's profile as the dog stared out the side window, and she felt that old familiar switch in her body, something sliding from rest into ready. She hated how quickly it happened. She hated that she was relieved to have something clear to do. The community center was a squat brick building that served as everything when the weather got mean: a meeting hall, a warming shelter, a temporary clinic. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, disinfectant, wet wool, and old pine cleaner. A volunteer in a reflective vest guided them to a folding cot beside portable heaters. Luke was stripped of wet layers and wrapped in thermal blankets. A paramedic checked his pupils, listened to his lungs, and started warm fluids. Claire stayed close, hands hovering like she might physically hold his heartbeat in place if she tried hard enough. When Luke's eyelids fluttered, Claire leaned in. "You're safe right now," she said. "Just breathe." His gaze found her, unfocused but stubborn. He gave the smallest nod. Sheriff Hank Moreland arrived 10 minutes later, snow clinging to his shoulders like ash. He was 58, tall and broad, built like a man carved out of old lumber. A gray mustache sat over a tight mouth, and deep lines cut down from his nose to his chin. Weather lines, worry lines, the kind you earned by listening to too many stories that ended badly. His eyes were sharp and practical, but there was a tired kindness behind them that didn't announce itself. He shook Claire's hand once, firm, and then looked at Luke. "You call this in?" he asked. Claire nodded. Hank's gaze flicked to Argo. "Dog found him?" "My K9, Claire said. He picked up blood." Hank exhaled slowly, the sound like a door opening to something he didn't want to enter. "That mill's been trouble before," he said. "Not like this." He turned to Tessa. "Get me everything, prints, tracks, any vehicle sign." Tessa nodded and moved, already pulling on another pair of gloves like she could will the cold to behave. Luke's voice came in fragments at first. He explained the lie he'd used, drunk worker, lost in a storm, because it bought him minutes, and minutes were sometimes the only currency that mattered. He told them he'd followed vehicle movement patterns for days. He'd noticing snowmobile runs that didn't match any local hunting or logging routes. He described the men who grabbed him, faces hidden by scarves, movements too coordinated to be random thugs. The part that mattered most was the reason he was still alive. They hadn't left him outside all night. The mill had a partial roof, and during the roughest questioning, they'd used a propane heater near the beam, more to keep him conscious than to save him. Then something went wrong. He heard shouting, the high whine of a snowmobile flipping, and the panic of a schedule cracking. The guards ran. The heater died. The cold moved in. That was when he started to fade. A single headlight swept across the frosted windows, slow, deliberate, then snapped off, and for one silent beat the room felt like it had stopped breathing. Argo's growl rose from deep in his chest, not loud, but warning, an animal sound that made every human spine straighten. Claire's skin tightened as if a wire had been pulled. Sheriff Hank moved to the window, peering through streaked glass. Outside, across the parking lot, a vehicle rolled by without using its full lights, then turned the corner and vanished behind the snow curtain. Hank didn't speak for a moment. Tessa came up beside him, jaw set. "That wasn't normal," she said. Hank's eyes narrowed. "No," he replied. "That was someone checking who's awake." Claire forced herself to inhale slowly, keeping her breathing steady so Luke wouldn't feel her fear. She knelt by Argo and rested her gloved hand on the dog's neck. The shepherd's muscles were taut under her palm, his ears angled toward the door, his nose tasting the air even through the building's stale warmth. "Easy," she murmured. "Stay with me." Argo looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw that calm, unshakable certainty dogs carried. Whatever was outside, he would meet it with all he had. The thought pierced her. She had come here to heal. Instead, she was being asked to choose courage again when her heart still felt bruised. Her phone buzzed. A text from a local contact, forwarded from traffic cameras, and a citizen report. A snowmobile had been seen cutting across the old access road toward the frozen lake route, moving fast despite the storm. Another message followed. 2 words that mattered. Not alone. Sheriff Hank glanced at the screen and then at Claire. "They're moving tonight," he said quietly. "Like your guy said." Luke tried to lift his head, our pain flashing across his face, but his voice came out anyway. "If they make the lake," he whispered, "you won't see them." Claire swallowed hard. She felt the weight of her exhaustion, the temptation to step back and let someone else carry it. Then she felt Argo press against her leg, solid and warm and present. Something in her softened, not into comfort, but into resolve. "We don't wait for morning," she said. Sheriff Hank's expression tightened, then he nodded once. Tessa's eyes sparked with grim readiness, the kind that said she was scared too, but she'd go anyway. Argo stood, nails clicking lightly on the floor, as if he understood the decision had been made. Outside, the blizzard kept falling like it had all the time in the world, while inside the community center, Claire stared at the message about the snowmobile heading for the frozen lake and realized the storm wasn't hiding the truth anymore. It was speeding it up. The decision to move before morning felt like stepping into a river you couldn't see. Outside the community center, snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, turning streetlights into pale halos and making every parked car look like a half-buried animal. Sheriff Hank Moreland stood in the entryway, like a gate made of flesh and wool, shoulders squared, mustache rimed with melted flakes, eyes scanning the dark as if the storm itself might be carrying a message. Claire watched him speak briefly to Deputy Tessa Pike, watched the younger woman nod with her braid swinging against the back of her parka, and she felt that familiar tension between urgency and caution. Luke lay on the cot behind them, wrapped in heat blankets, a monitor blinking steady green near his head. His breathing was still shallow, but it was no longer fading. That alone felt like a small mercy. Argo waited at Claire's knee, sable coat dry now, ears high, gaze fixed on the door as if he could already hear the lake calling. Claire's phone vibrated again, and this time the number on the screen was not local. It was the one you answered when rest was officially over. Special Agent Marcus Vance arrived with 2 vehicles and a calm that felt almost unnatural against the violence of the weather. He was 41, tall and lean in a way that made him look longer than he was wide, with close-cropped black hair and a neatly trimmed beard that softened a face built from angles. His eyes were dark and deliberate, the eyes of a man who had learned to keep his emotions behind a locked door because people leaned on him when everything cracked. Marcus's voice was low, even, and he spoke with the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "Rowan," he said, not warm, not cold, just certain. "You're reactivated. Task Force is live. Log starts now." He handed her a thin folder and a simple wristband pass as if paperwork could hold back chaos. Claire nodded once. Her body didn't celebrate. It just complied. Sheriff Hank pulled Marcus aside, and together they mapped the night on a table that had once held potluck casseroles and bingo cards. A map of old access roads lay beneath their hands, marked with pen lines and coffee rings. Tessa pointed to the frozen lake route, her finger steady, and said, "The snowmobile was seen here. If they cut across the ice, they can hit the back logging road and disappear." Marcus listened without interrupting, then spoke. "We'll run A/B. Plan A is silent approach, cut roots. You rescue first. Plan B, if we're burned, we switch. Block and pull victims. No hero chase." Claire felt her jaw tighten at the last words, and Marcus saw it. "I know," he said quietly, not unkind, "but the mission is the people, not the pride." That landed inside her like a hard truth you couldn't argue with. They moved out in a tight convoy, tires crunching over snowpack, headlights on low to reduce glare. The world beyond the beams was a drifting void. Claire rode with Marcus while Tessa followed behind with Sheriff Hank. Argo sat between Claire's boots, still as a statue, but vibrating with readiness. His nose twitched now and then, catching faint traces through the sealed vehicle. Old smoke, diesel, the iron tang of cold air. Claire kept her gloved hand on his back, feeling the warmth there and the steady rise and fall of his breathing, grounding herself when her mind tried to sprint ahead to worst-case endings. They parked a half-mile from the cabin cluster near the lake and walked in. Snow creaked under boots. Pine branches sagged with white weight, releasing soft cascades that sounded like whispers falling. The air smelled clean and sharp until, suddenly, it didn't. As they neared the trees by the shoreline, a different odor threaded the cold. Fuel, sweat, something like disinfectant. Argo's head lifted. He pulled slightly left, then checked himself, waiting for Claire's signal. "Work," she murmured, and the dog moved with controlled precision, a dark shape gliding through white. The first sign that the criminals were not amateurs came as a tiny, almost invisible line strung between two trees, wire, thin as a thought, tied to a small bell. Tessa saw it at the last second and froze, her eyes widening. Sheriff Hank eased a pocket knife out and lifted the wire free with hands that didn't shake. "They've been practicing," he muttered. Marcus's gaze narrowed. "Or someone trained them," he replied. Past the trees, half hidden by drifts, stood a low cabin with a sagging porch and boarded windows. It looked abandoned, but Claire felt the wrongness in the silence, the kind that meant people were trying to be quiet on purpose. Marcus raised his hand. "Stop." Another gesture. "Spread." Claire's breath fogged in slow puffs. Her pulse beat in her throat. Argo crouched slightly, ears angled forward. They were almost there, almost in the pocket of control, when a faint red blink appeared on a trunk ahead, like an insect eye opening. Claire's stomach dropped. A pin camera, small, cheap, and perfectly placed. Marcus's hand snapped down. Freeze. A flare ignited beyond the cabin, a sudden violent blossom of white-orange light that turned the falling snow into glittering knives, and for one stunned heartbeat, every shadow became a silhouette. Then the shouting began. A soft electronic chirp cut through the air, followed by the sharp, frantic jingle of another bell line deeper in the trees. The criminals moved fast, using noise and fire like a curtain. Marcus's voice cut through it, steady and hard. "Plan B! Go!" Sheriff Hank and Tessa rushed the cabin entrance while Marcus and his team swung wide to block the tree line. Claire pushed in behind Argo, and the smell hit her hard. Fear, fuel, the sour sting of sweat trapped under layers. The sound of boots on wood echoed, too many feet, too many directions. In a back room, huddled under blankets and tarp, were people, men and women, some barely standing, their eyes wide with the stunned look of those who have been held too long in the dark. Claire's chest tightened as if an old wound had been touched. "You're safe," she said, voice low but firm. "We're getting you out." One woman stumbled forward, trembling so hard her teeth clicked. She was about 32, medium height, with dark hair tangled and damp against her cheeks and a warm brown complexion turned ashen with cold. Her eyes were huge and glossy with shock, but there was fierce life in them too, like a candle refusing to go out. "Anna," she whispered when Claire asked her name. "Anna Reyes." Her hands were raw, wrists bruised. When Claire reached for her, Anna flinched at first, and then clutched Claire's sleeve as if it was the only real thing left in the world. Outside, someone kicked a barrel, and it clanged, followed by the whoosh of burning fuel. Smoke curled into the storm, the smell harsh and oily. The criminals were buying seconds with fire and confusion. Claire heard a snowmobile engine rev somewhere in the trees, then another, the sound rising and falling like angry insects. Her instinct screamed to chase. Marcus did not. He held the line. He guided victims out in staggered groups, keeping them low, keeping them moving. Sheriff Hank barked short instructions to deputies, his voice carrying authority like a rope. Tessa moved with quick precision, covering blind angles, face pale with cold and focus. Argo stopped at the threshold, nose down, then swung his head toward the shoreline access trail. His body went rigid with certainty. Claire followed, heart pounding. There, half covered already, fresh snowmobile tread cut the snow, crisp at the edges, new enough that the storm hadn't softened it. Argo sniffed once, then again, then lifted his head and stared into the white, as if he could see the rider who had vanished. Claire felt a cold realization settle into her bones. Someone had planned this route, rehearsed it, trusted the storm to erase them. Marcus stepped up behind her, close enough that she could hear his breath through his scarf. "We mark it," he said. "We don't run into the dark." Claire swallowed hard, tasting metal in her mouth. She wanted to argue. She wanted to sprint after that fading engine sound and drag the night's mastermind into the light. But she looked back at the rescued people, huddled near the vehicles, are wrapped in blankets, eyes still wide. She saw Anna's shaking hands. She heard Luke's hoarse warning in her memory. And she felt Argo's steady presence at her side, a living reminder that survival came first. Argo pressed his nose once more into the snowmobile track, then looked up at Claire with a fixed, unblinking certainty, and she understood they didn't need to chase yet. The dog had already given them a direction, and the storm had already revealed what it tried to hide. Morning didn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like permission. The blizzard loosened its grip just enough for the world to show outlines again, rooftops, trees, the curve of a road, still buried, still bitter, but no longer completely erased. Inside the community center, the air was heavy with wet coats and tired bodies. Volunteers moved quietly with coffee urns and stacks of blankets, as if loud sounds might break something fragile in the room. Claire sat on a folding chair with Argo pressed against her shin, his sable coat catching the fluorescent light in dark ripples. He looked calm, but his ears kept turning toward the doors, as if the storm had taught him that danger preferred entrances. Anna Reyes sat across from Claire at a table that still had bingo numbers taped to the edge. She was wrapped in a donated sweatshirt that hung a little loose on her slim frame. Her dark hair had been brushed back, but it still curled in stubborn, damp strands around her face. Up close, she had a warm brown complexion with chapped lips and a small, healed scar near her collarbone, an old mark, not from last night. Her hands trembled when she lifted a paper cup, not from cold alone, but from the kind of shock that made the body forget it was allowed to be steady. Her eyes kept drifting to the nearest exit, and then back to the floor, as if she didn't trust either direction. Claire spoke to her softly, without pushing. "You're safe here," she said, the words simple, almost plain. "You don't have to remember everything at once." Anna nodded, swallowing hard. She had the look of someone who had learned to endure by shrinking, by taking up less space, by moving quieter, by hoping cruelty passed over her like bad weather. And yet there was something else in her, too, something stubborn under the fear. When she looked at Claire, it wasn't gratitude that came first, it was recognition. Two women who had both learned that survival was not always gentle. Marcus Vance stood a few steps back, leaning against a wall with his arms folded, watching with a patience that felt earned. In daylight he looked even more controlled, trim beard, eyes that missed nothing, posture relaxed in a way that never turned sloppy. He didn't interrupt. He let Anna's mind find its own order. Sheriff Hank moved in and out, coordinating with deputies, his boots leaving puddles on the tile floor. Tessa Pike sat at another table, writing notes, her braid still tight, her face pale with fatigue but sharpened by focus. Anna's voice came in fragments at first. "They covered the smell," she whispered, frowning as if her own memory offended her. Claire leaned forward slightly. "What kind of smell?" Anna pressed her fingertips to her temple, eyes closing. "Gas," she said. "Always gas, like snowmobile, like a garage." She opened her eyes again, and her gaze sharpened for a second, as if something clicked into place. "And perfume. Cheap. Sweet. Too much. Like they poured it on." Her nose wrinkled. It didn't hide anything. It just made it worse. Claire felt Argo shift beside her, as if the word perfume had turned into a scent in the air. "Tobacco?" Claire asked gently. Anna nodded quickly, relief flickering because someone was naming the horror with her. "Yes. Heavy. Like he smoked to stay awake." She hugged the cup closer. The man who talked, he didn't stay long. He came in, said a few words, left, like he didn't want to be seen. But everyone listened when he spoke. Anna's mouth tightened. They were afraid of him. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "A coordinator," he murmured to Sheriff Hank, and Hank gave a slow, grim nod. Claire didn't correct them. She just watched Anna's face as the memory settled. Claire knew that kind of fear, not loud panic, the quiet kind that lived in your bones long after the room was warm again. Marcus unfolded a map on the table and spoke in a calm that gave structure to chaos. "This isn't a border sprint," he said. "It's internal movement. They use remote terrain to avoid main roads, frozen lake, backlogging routes, and then a pickup point where a truck can blend into normal traffic." Sheriff Hank tapped a spot near an old service highway. "There's an abandoned garage out here," he said. "Used to belong to a tow outfit. Closed 10 years. Tessa looked up, eyes sharp. "Locals still cut through there," she added. "Good place to swap vehicles without being seen." Claire's stomach tightened, not from fear of the criminals, but from the way her mind wanted to replay the flare, the shouting, the silhouettes in the snow. PTSD didn't always come as a breakdown. Sometimes it came as a loop you couldn't stop watching. She forced her breathing into a steady pattern, 4 counts in, 4 out. She scanned the room, doors, windows, exits, then brought her focus back to the table, back to the next step. Argo lifted his head when Marcus said, "Garage." His nose worked, at catching invisible threads. Claire rested her hand on his neck. "You ready?" she whispered. Argo's ears flicked toward her voice, and his gaze softened for a heartbeat. Then it hardened again, purposeful. They moved in a controlled formation, not a lone hunt. Marcus assigned Claire and Argo as the point team, muzzle of the search, not the whole rifle. Tessa rode with Claire, while a backup unit followed a few minutes behind, close enough to help, far enough not to announce their presence. The road toward the garage was a narrow ribbon through forest and drifts. The sky stayed low and gray. Snow still fell, but lighter now, as if the storm was exhausted. Claire stared out at the trees sliding past and thought about how the world could look so clean while carrying such filth underneath. At the edge of the service road, they parked and went on foot. The abandoned garage emerged from the trees like a dark throat, corrugated metal walls, half-collapsed awning, a sliding door crusted with ice. The air smelled of cold steel and old oil, but beneath it, Argo caught something fresh. He pulled slightly, then slowed, nose down, tracing a line that curved around the side of the building. The snowmobile tracks here were crisp at the edges, newer than the surrounding drifts. Claire noted them, her mind cataloging details the way her heart used to catalog fear. A sudden metallic tap came from inside the garage, one light clink, like a tool brushing a chain, and the sound stopped the world for a single breath, leaving only the soft hiss of falling snow and the beating of Claire's heart. Tessa raised 2 fingers in a silent signal. Hold. Claire lowered her center of gravity, breath slow, eyes scanning the door seams, the broken window, the shadows beneath the awning. Argo froze, ears forward, gaze locked on the garage door as if his eyes could pierce metal. Claire felt the familiar pressure of adrenaline, the urge to rush, to end it fast. She forced herself to stay in the moment, to be disciplined, to trust the team. Argo's nose dipped again. He sniffed the snow by the threshold and then turned his head slightly toward the back corner of the building. Claire followed his line and saw a faint smear on the snow, tiny dark flecks that looked like rust until she realized what they were. Blood. Small drops, spaced like someone trying not to bleed. Tessa's eyes widened. She shifted her stance, hand near her weapon, but not drawing it. "He's close," she mouthed. Claire nodded once. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. She could also feel the weight of responsibility. People they'd already saved, people who might still be moving across the ice, and the predator who thought the storm would keep protecting him. Argo stopped so sharply his nails scratched ice, staring at the garage door with a fixed certainty. And Claire understood that whatever waited inside was near enough to hear their breath, and that one mistake would let the blizzard swallow the truth again. The abandoned garage looked even emptier up close, as if it had been built to swallow sound. Corrugated metal walls wore a skin of frost, and the sliding door sat half buried in wind-packed snow, its track frozen with old ice. Claire could hear her own breathing through her scarf. She could hear Tessa's boots shifting a fraction behind her. And she could hear Argo's low, steady exhale as he held himself perfectly still, nose aimed at the seam of the door like a compass needle locked on north. They did not rush. Marcus had drilled the point team on discipline before they ever left the community center: confirm, contain, then move. Claire kept repeating that in her mind as if it were a prayer. Confirm, contain, move. She let her eyes do the work first: door seams, broken window panes, a sagging awning, the narrow alley between the garage and a snow-choked shed. Nothing moved. And yet Argo's posture said everything was moving, just not where human eyes could catch it. The backup unit's headlights stayed far back, muted, hidden by trees. Claire could feel the presence of that safety net like a hand on her shoulder, even if she couldn't see it. Tessa lifted 2 fingers again, hold, then pointed toward the side corner. Claire nodded once, and together they shifted along the wall, careful not to crunch louder than the wind. Argo followed, shoulders rolling in silent control, sable coat dusted in white. The smell hit Claire first this time, not the dog. A harsh chemical sting, like cheap cleaner, layered over gasoline and stale tobacco. It was the kind of scent someone used when they wanted to erase a story. Then Argo's nose dipped to a faint smear in the snow, and he let out a soft huff that meant, yes, this is the line. Blood drops, tiny, spaced carefully, led toward the back. Whoever had been cut was trying not to leave a trail, but winter had a way of keeping receipts. Then the trap sprang, not with fireworks, but with human patience. A shadow detached from the alley beside the shed, close enough that Claire felt the movement more than saw it. The man came fast, built stocky and compact, wearing a dark insulated jacket and a face covering that hid everything but his eyes. Those eyes were sharp and mean, the eyes of someone who had decided long ago that mercy was for other people. He was not the boss. He moved like a tool, not a mind. Tessa shouted once, short, instinctive, then tried to pivot, but the ground betrayed them. Ice under powder. Her boot skidded. Claire stepped to stabilize, and in that half-second, the attacker collided with her shoulder like a battering ram. Claire went down hard, breath blasting out of her lungs. The cold slapped her cheek through the fabric of her hood. Pain flared at her ribs, and the past hit too, not as a memory you watch, but as a moment you relive. A flash of bright light, a room too loud, a scream cut short. Her nervous system fired the old alarm and tried to drag her back into that other scene where she'd been too late to stop what happened. The garage door suddenly jerked open an inch with a metallic shriek, just enough to spill a slice of yellow light onto the snow, then slammed shut again, and in that blink Claire saw a silhouette moving inside, calm and unhurried, like someone walking away from a fire he started. The sound snapped her back, not fully, but enough. Tessa dropped to one knee beside her, yanking Claire by the strap of her vest toward the shallow cover of the wall. "Claire, move!" she hissed, voice tight with fear and determination. Tessa's face was flushed red from cold and adrenaline, freckles stark against her pale skin, and her eyes held a fierce focus that didn't leave room for panic. She had one hand on her weapon, but she wasn't firing wildly. She was trying to protect her partner first, the way good people did when the world turned ugly. The attacker raised something, too close for Claire to identify cleanly. A knife? A small pistol? It didn't matter. The intent was the same. Argo moved. He launched once, disciplined and precise, not a wild leap, but a trained strike that lasted only seconds. His jaws closed on the attacker's forearm, and his weight twisted, pulling the man off balance. The attacker grunted, stumbling, and Tessa seized the opening to drag Claire fully behind the corner. Claire's hands shook as she tried to force her breath back into rhythm. She heard Argo's growl, deep and controlled, and then a sharp sound, too sharp to be only metal. A crack or a punch of impact. Argo's body jerked. Claire's heart dropped. Argo released and staggered back, snow spraying from his paws. A dark stain spread fast along his shoulder and chest, startling against the white. He tried to stand square again, but his legs wobbled. His eyes found Claire's with the same steady intelligence they always held, and in them was no fear, only urgency, as if he were saying, "Go. Live." The attacker cursed, backing away, wounded and angry, but not dead. He wasn't there to win. He was there to delay. Claire understood it with a sick clarity. The silhouette inside the garage, calm, unhurried, was already leaving by another route. A side exit, a hidden vehicle swap. Tessa shouted into her radio, "Contact! Ambush at the garage! Need backup now!" Her voice stayed controlled, but Claire heard the tremor under it. The backup unit responded immediately, engines rising in the distance. Claire crawled to Argo, ignoring the sting in her ribs. She pressed her gloved hands to his wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Stay," she whispered, voice breaking. "Stay with me, buddy." Argo's breathing came in short pulls, steam fogging the air. His sable coat was wet and clumping where the blood spread. He tried to lick her glove once, a faint gesture that felt like a promise and an apology. Near the garage door seam, something fell into the snow with a dull thud, small, dark, rectangular. A satellite phone. It lay half-buried, screen cracked, but unmistakable. Evidence, left in the hurry. Proof that couldn't be explained away as a hunter's lost device. Sheriff Hank arrived with deputies in a rush of headlights and crunching tires, moving fast but not reckless. He took one look at Argo, and his face hardened into something older than law, something human. "Get that dog inside," he ordered. "Now." They loaded Argo into the back of a vehicle, warmed to the highest heat, blankets piled around him. Claire climbed in beside him, refusing to let go. The drive to the emergency vet clinic felt longer than it should have, every minute stretched thin by fear. Snow hit the windshield in soft bursts like ash. Doctor. Our Eliana Park met them at the door, already gloved, already moving. She was 45, with dark hair streaked slightly with silver and pulled into a neat bun that didn't shift even when she moved fast. Her face was composed, oval and serious, with kind eyes that held the calm of someone who had faced too many desperate moments and learned to be steady anyway. She spoke with a clipped warmth, efficient but not cold. "Bring him," she said. "Careful with his head. Keep pressure." Claire followed into the bright, sterile room, then was stopped gently at the threshold as the team took over. Dr. Park glanced once at Claire, saw the shaking hands, the snow in her eyelashes, the way her mouth trembled when she tried to stay silent. "This is going to be close," she said, voice low and honest. "Tonight is the line." End of Chapter 5. Claire sat outside the treatment room, back against a cold wall, staring through the small window as snow drifted past the glass, and she realized the storm had taken its price. Yet Argo had paid it for her without hesitation. The storm didn't stop all at once. It softened reluctantly, as if winter had to be convinced that mercy was allowed. Snow still drifted past the clinic windows in slow, steady curtains, but the wind no longer slammed the glass like a fist. Inside, the emergency vet suite smelled of antiseptic, warm metal, and that faint animal scent that always carried something honest. Life, fear, hope, all tangled together. Claire sat on a plastic chair that dug into her spine, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles looked bleached. Through the small pane in the door, she could see flashes of movement, gloved hands, a steel tray, Dr. Eliana Park's dark bun bobbing as she leaned in close. Argo was somewhere under that bright light, somewhere between staying and leaving. Outside the clinic, but the town moved the way good towns did when they were frightened, quietly, with purpose. Pastor Caleb Monroe showed up with a thermos of coffee big enough to be ridiculous and a stack of blankets folded so neatly they looked like a promise. Caleb was 50, medium height, with a sturdy build and a kind face that wore winter like it had seen worse. His hair was salt and pepper, kept short, and his eyes were warm without being naive. He didn't speak in speeches. He spoke in simple sentences and steady hands. He coordinated volunteers at the community center, arranged hot meals, found spare rooms for victims who couldn't sleep in a public hall, and made sure deputies and paramedics had something warm in their stomachs before they went back out into the cold. It wasn't glamorous. It was faithful. Marcus Vance worked from the sheriff's office with the same calm he had carried into the storm. The satellite phone recovered near the garage gave them a ladder. Anna's recollections gave them the rungs. "Cheap perfume," she had said. "Gas, tobacco." The phone's contacts and call logs, paired with patterns of snowmobile sightings and supply purchases, let Marcus identify more than one meeting point. Not just the lake route, but the places the route fed into. A storage unit on the edge of a closed mill town, a back lot behind a shuttered diner, a private driveway that didn't match any resident record. Sheriff Hank's deputies moved on those leads in coordinated sweeps. They didn't chase Darius Klein into the dark. They tightened every door he thought was still open. More people were found that night and the next morning, cold, terrified, alive, and the kind of alive that deserved reverence. In the clinic, Dr. Park finally stepped out, her gloves stripped off, her sleeves pushed up slightly. Under the harsh hallway light, her face looked older than it had at the door, not from age, but from responsibility. She met Claire's eyes and didn't soften the truth. "He was hit by a blade," she said, voice controlled. "Deep laceration, significant blood loss." Claire swallowed, throat dry as paper. Dr. Park continued, clear and structured, as if putting the nightmare into steps made it survivable. "First, we stop the bleeding and repair what we can. That's surgery. Second, we keep him warm and support his blood pressure. Shock is as dangerous as the cut. Third, the next 48 hours are infection risk. If his body turns on him, we fight that too." She paused, then added with quiet honesty, Tonight is still the line." Claire nodded as if she understood, though part of her felt like it was floating above her own body. She had seen men on gurneys. She had heard monitors go flat. She had watched families collapse in waiting rooms. The same cold logic tried to rise in her mind. Prepare for loss. Protect yourself. Don't hope too hard. A single soft whine came from behind the treatment door, an electronic monitor changing pitch, followed by a brief sharp beep, and Claire's heart stopped long enough to feel the silence inside her before the sound leveled out again. She pressed her palm against the door, eyes closed, and forced herself to breathe. In, out, in, out. The old training helped, but it didn't heal. What healed was what came next. A nurse cracked the door and said, "You can sit with him for a minute, but you can't touch anything." It was a small permission, but it felt like grace. Argo lay under a warming blanket, fur shaved in a strip along his shoulder where stitches ran like a dark seam holding a world together. His sable coat looked dulled by exhaustion, his mouth slightly open, tongue dry, breath shallow but present. His ears twitched once, barely a movement, and Claire felt tears hit her scarf before she realized she was crying. She sat beside him and spoke in a whisper that was half confession, half prayer. "I came here to rest," she said, voice rough. "I thought I could hide in snow and pretend the world wouldn't find me." Her breath shook. "And then you did what you always do. You found the truth." She remembered all the nights she'd woken up convinced she was too late. Too late to stop the scream. And too late to pull someone back. Too late to fix the thing that broke. That belief had burrowed into her like a parasite. You are always arriving after the damage is done. Claire leaned closer, careful not to touch the wound, and let her words fall slow and steady. "You didn't let me be late," she told him. "You pulled me back to the light." When Anna Reyes was stable enough to walk with an escort, she came to the clinic quietly, shoulders hunched in borrowed winter clothes. She stood at the doorway and looked at Argo with wet eyes. She didn't perform gratitude. She simply placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "Gracias," so softly it barely carried. Then she looked at Claire and nodded, a woman-to-woman acknowledgement that what had happened between them was bigger than language. Dr. Park stepped in behind them and, because she understood that people needed one breath of humor to survive a night like this, she glanced at Argo's chart and said, "He's stubborn." She lifted an eyebrow at Claire. "Stubborn like a Michigan rock." Claire let out a shaky sound that turned into a laugh and a sob at the same time. It felt strange in her throat, like she hadn't used that part of herself in years. The hardest night passed in slow, merciless hours. Claire dozed in a chair and jolted awake at every change of sound. Morning returned, pale and quiet. On the second night, Argo's ear flicked when Claire spoke his name. On the third morning, his eyes opened, cloudy, tired, but there. His tongue moved, a faint dry lick against the air, and then, with effort, he touched his nose to Claire's fingers when she offered them near his muzzle. Not a miracle of thunder, a miracle of stubborn life and timely hands. Marcus texted Claire near dusk. Klein still running. But now the task force had enough to crush his network. Contacts, locations, witness testimony, patterns pinned down like evidence under glass. Claire stared at the message, then looked at Argo, whose breathing was stronger now, chest rising with steady resolve. Claire walked Argo out onto the clinic porch where the snow fell softer than before, and as he leaned into her leg like a living promise, she whispered, "This time, we won't be late." Sometimes winter doesn't only fall on roads and rooftops, it falls inside a person too. It settles into the places where fear lives, where regret hides, where the mind keeps replaying what it couldn't change. Claire thought rest would fix her, but it wasn't rest that healed her. It was purpose. It was being needed again. And it was learning, slowly, that a wounded heart can still be a lighthouse if it chooses to keep the light on. This story carries a simple lesson. The world doesn't always warn us with clear words. Sometimes it warns us with a dog's paws, a sudden turn of the head, a refusal to move forward. Animals don't rationalize danger the way humans do. They don't negotiate with denial. They sense what is real, and they act. Argo's instincts were not magic tricks. They were a reminder that God often places truth in front of us through humble means, through the quiet creatures and quiet moments we tend to overlook. There is also a hard truth here, and a hopeful one. Evil is often organized, patient, and confident that no one will notice. But goodness can be organized too. A sheriff who shows up, a deputy who refuses to leave someone behind, a community that brings food and blankets without needing applause, a victim who finds her voice again, an agent who keeps moving even while shaking inside. Real change rarely arrives as one dramatic hero scene. It arrives as a chain of people doing the next right thing. And then there is the deepest lesson. Love is not always gentle, but it is always brave. Argo did not save Claire because he was fearless. He saved her because loyalty is stronger than fear. That kind of love costs something, and that is why it matters. If you have ever loved a pet, you understand this. They do not love us for our victories. They love us in our storms. They stay close when we are tired, broken, or ashamed. They remind us we are still worth protecting. That is why kindness to animals is not a small issue. It is a measure of who we are. If a dog can offer courage without being asked, then surely a human can offer compassion without needing a reward. Feed the stray when you can. Speak gently to the frightened animal. Report cruelty instead of walking past it. Support shelters, rescues, and the people who do the quiet work of care. In everyday life, loving animals teaches us how to love people better too, because it trains the heart to choose mercy on purpose. If you're looking for a miracle, don't always expect thunder. Sometimes miracles look like a surgeon's steady hands at midnight. Sometimes they look like a stranger showing up with a blanket. And sometimes they look like a dog surviving one more hour, then one more day. God often works through ordinary faithfulness, through timely help, through stubborn life that refuses to quit. The miracle is not only that Argo lived, the miracle is that people chose compassion over fear and light over hiding. So here is the invitation this story leaves behind. When you step outside tomorrow, pay attention to the quiet signals. Check on the neighbor who seems withdrawn. Speak to the cashier like they matter. Slow down on winter roads. Notice the animal that looks lost. Do the next kind thing that is within your reach. You don't have to be famous to be a blessing. You only have to be willing. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Or tell us about an animal who once changed your life. And if you want more stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you, keep you safe, comfort your heart, and guide your steps through every season.